Welcome to Dwellings, a podcast from the City of San Jose Housing Department, where we talk with thought leaders about ending homelessness, building affordable housing, and key housing policies. I'm Jeff Scott, and I'll be your host for Season 5 of Dwellings. On today's episode, I'm joined by Eric Sullivan, the new director of the City of San Jose Housing Department. Eric will be sharing his vision for the Housing Department and his priorities as the department addresses the city's housing stock, homelessness, and efforts to make our community more equitable and inclusive. And so with that, welcome, Eric. Why don't you start off by telling our audience a little bit about yourself?
So I'm Eric Sullivan. I'm the Director of Housing for the City of San Jose. I came to this position after doing work in the housing space for what's now over 18 years. That began with the state of Pennsylvania, working in the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Housing Development, and then working for the Housing Authority, for Philadelphia Housing Authority. Then in the city of Denver, then the Tulsa Housing Authority, and then now here working for the city of San Jose. So much of my career has been focused on development and housing policy and looking at various strategies to build out and rebuild communities throughout cities that have historically been disenfranchised, and now as urbanization taken hold of numerous cities over the last 20 years. How do we look at ways to not only rebuild these communities with the influx of more economic opportunity, development, and investment, but also preserve the residents who are there to give them an on-ramp to this expansion and investment in their communities. So over 20 deals, over 5,000 units preserved, newly created, as well as mixed income, multi-phase, mixed-use projects. That history and that experience in various different types of housing finance, plans, strategies, executions using all sources of federal, state, and local funds really much prepared me for this opportunity here in San Jose and to participate in a lot of the innovative work that has and will be done as we look at ways in which to grow San Jose's housing stock. And within that growth of housing stock, how do we expand unique innovative options for housing affordability? So we can not only add more members to our communities, but also preserve the members and the families in our communities throughout the city. And so that's kind of really what brought me to San Jose, and always kind of viewing California, in the forefront as, that's a place of innovation where they have so much growth and they're doing innovative things around housing and housing finance. And in all the work that I've done in Denver and Tulsa and Philadelphia, there was always cities in California who are doing unique and creative things. And I wanted to be a part of that creation, of that innovation, and bring with that, deep experience in housing finance and development and redevelopment, and bringing community to be a part of those conversations and expanding the options and partnerships with housing developers from all types and sectors who share this vision of getting to abundant housing stock within the city of San Jose. And so that's why I'm here and excited to be here.
Well, great. Thank you, Eric. Thank you also for joining us today and taking a little bit of time out of your busy schedule. With that, I guess I'd like to start off the conversation by having you talk a little bit about your vision for the housing department and your vision for the broader housing stock in our city. Where do you think it's going? Where should it go? Where would you like to see it go?
Thanks, Jeff, for that question. As I think about this work and think about this work within the context of my history and experiences, and within the context of the housing element that sets forth as adopted by mayor and council, the policy directions for how to get to abundant housing stock, how to get to preservation of our communities, and how to get to innovative strategies to eventually achieve functional zero and unsheltered homelessness. I look at this work on a continuum. And that continuum goes from beginning with prevention, and within that line, how do we invest in communities, in households and neighborhoods, with leverage with our partners in the public sector, private sector, to stop the inflow of families who are at risk of experiencing homelessness and individuals. So that's kind of the first line. Where is our work around prevention and partnership with various community stakeholders? And then as we move up that continuum, where do we look at our existing unhoused neighbors and where they live in RVs, in cars, in encampments, along the creeks and rivers? And in response to, the water board decision, how do we find unique strategies to place them in more decent, safe, habitable spaces along that continuum? Safe parking, safe sleeping as another ladder there. But more importantly, where do we look at ways to get to throughput to transition them into our interim housing sites, into our permanent supportive housing sites? And how do we as a city better synchronize our work with the investments made by the county in our congregate shelters, in our board and care beds, in their EIH interim housing sites? Let's look at that continuum, see where those numbers are across those various forms of spaces and shelter and homes. And where do we make those strategic investments to get to functional zero on unsheltered homelessness? Where do we make investments to build out our permanent supportive housing units so those who are discharged from county funded board and care beds can have a place to land? Where do we get to investments in building out our interim housing sites where there may be a branch of interim housing sites that are built for a true temporary nature and may move throughout the city over the years? And there may be a branch of our interim housing sites that are built in a more permanent state. One of the best examples of well-crafted, designed, operated, and maintained interim housing sites is the Guadalupe interim housing site that was converted shipping containers and has full bathrooms in every unit and is connected to deep services within that community. And many of those community members who were discharged from an encampment to the site choose to live there long term. So where do we create our housing options that include interim housing site as a more permanent landing spot for some of our families? And how do we manage those sites accordingly? Looking at those dual branches of interim housing as a component of our housing stock, built to the example as Guadalupe, and look at other examples where it's more temporary. So we have to look at that throughput to PSH, to other housing options. So as I think about this outlaying of the housing continuum and then overlaying that with our housing finance strategies, where we make the most strategic, impactful investments that'll get to the ultimate outcomes here of ending unsheltered homelessness and finding housing options for a broad scale of families to achieve that permanency of residency here in San Jose. And so when I think about that continuum and how do we overlay our financing across the continuum, I think about the structure within our department. So just the other day, we had a department-wide meeting talking about how do we best align our 3 business units: housing production, preservation of our units and tenants through our rent stabilization program and grants programs, and then thirdly, our homelessness response. Those are our 3 primary units that align to our 3 primary objectives within the housing element and within our work across that continuum of housing options. That is sort of our strategy of implementation that we're going to look to execute on, that will take the policy objectives laid forth in the housing element, in our community action plan to end homelessness, and bring that down to an implementation strategy that is driven towards a particular number to solve for the number of folks who are experiencing homelessness, are unsheltered neighbors. We need to get that total amount of people into these total amount of shelter and housing spaces and stabilize our families who are at the lower end of those lower income AMIs to ensure they don't enter homelessness and build out our housing stock so that the prosperity and continuous job growth in this region, we have a place for that workforce to call home. So that is how the housing department, in servicing that entire housing continuum, will work with our private sector developers, nonprofit developers, our social service organizations, our community groups and organizations to find strategies and investments that allows them to secure and stabilize families in their communities, to build more housing for more communities and families to enter San Jose, and to find housing solutions of various types for our unsheltered neighbors. And that's how I think about the strategy for San Jose moving forward and getting to those practical, data-driven outcomes to achieve our housing goals.
You mentioned the housing continuum and you described that. You also made reference to our city's housing element. Can you tell us a little bit about how those two things align? And specifically, the housing element has a few goals: abundant housing stock, housing our homeless, housing stability, healthy neighborhoods, thriving neighborhoods, and racially and socially inclusive neighborhoods. Those are some of the big goals that are outlined in the housing element. So can you kind of briefly describe how you see this concept of the housing continuum aligning with the goals of the housing element?
Absolutely. So the housing element sets forth our policy objectives over the next 7 years to get to 62,000 units, right, which is our regional housing initiative goal. So that's what the housing element sets forth and the various policies and programs we look to implement. The implementation strategy across that housing continuum seeks to take the different aspects of the 100-page housing element and boil that down and focus it into, okay, across the housing continuum from board and care sites, which is an interim level bed for those with mental health and addiction issues, all the way through to interim housing sites, to congregate shelters, to emergency interim housing sites, to permanent supportive housing sites, to subsidized rental sites. How do we get to throughput so that our families who are experiencing homelessness and our housing element objectives to build out a housing stock sufficient to bring that population as close to zero as possible? Where do we make those investments at those different points in the continuum that's going to get to our end goal here of abundant housing stock? The housing element lays forth the policy. The implementation strategy talks about how the Department of Housing will make those investments, solving for that number. Here's how many units we need to get to unsheltered homelessness functional zero. Here's how many units we need to align our housing stock to growth in our workforce. Here's how many units we need to ensure we can stabilize our families and communities throughout the city so they can be a part of the growth and prosperity within the city. So the two align because one is about policy and objectives and a multi-year look and a 100-page document that sets forth different strategies. Where do we make strategic investments to actualize in achieving our goals in the housing element?
I heard you use a phrase, functional zero. It's kind of a buzz phrase that I've heard before. Can you quickly explain what that means to our audience?
Yeah, so functional zero is a term commonly used within homeless providers. As an example, in Houston, as they achieved functional zero in veterans homelessness, what that meant was that all persons who they had counted, year to date, who were experiencing homelessness and who were veterans, they were able to find them a successful housing option. And then as others entered and experienced homelessness, their time and experience of homelessness was short and brief, and they quickly found other housing. So it's not always a state of zero, it is a state of functional zero, because there's always a family or an individual who is going to have that experience of homelessness. But where do you make it brief? Where do you make it short? Where do you ensure that that connection to reconnect them to a housing option is efficient in its execution? The resources and prosperity of this region, as well as the political will and economic commitments from our employers and foundations, presents substantial opportunity to look at an implementation strategy that can solve for that number of unsheltered homelessness and say, let's make investments here, here, and here. And we can achieve this goal collectively in partnership with the county and our numerous organizations and providers to achieve our shared objective here, which is to find a home for everyone, including not just our unsheltered neighbors, but all of our workforce families who are participating in our ever prosperous economy here in the city. And for all the families who look to be a part, of the wonderful experience that I've had and my wife and I, Amanda, have had here in San Jose. This is a growth area. And so we need to think about our work in innovative ways that get to that growth as quickly as possible in our overall housing stock.
Do you have specific near-term priorities that you really focused on in your first few months on the job, maybe your first year on the job, that you think are going to be key to executing on those larger goals that you mentioned?
Yes, and I think those goals fall into three particular areas. Number one is positioning the housing department as a place where all organizations, all developers, all housing providers, all social service organizations, where all parties who share our objectives of building abundant housing stock, of servicing our unhoused neighbors to bring them to housing options, have a partner in the housing department. That's number one. Number two, how do we situate and align our processes, our policies, and our procedures to get to consistent application and execution to ensure programs like the Inclusionary Housing Ordinance, Rent Stabilization Program, financing and underwriting development deals, as just three examples. How do we ensure that our decisions are clear, consistent, reliable, so that developers, partners, even in our contracting as well with social supportive service providers, they know that in engaging for business with the housing department, the result of their application, of their response to a RFQ, of their search for funding through our underwriting programs or developing a housing action plan under the IHO. It is clear, it is consistent, and they get communications from the department that advance our shared objectives. So that's number two. Number three is then opening up and ensuring that our work is transparent and it is situated in a lane that the department is the neutral arbiter of the facts related to housing policy across the entire housing continuum, from our work in homelessness response to our work in rent stabilization and grants to our work in housing production. By aligning the department to those three objectives, we will be in a space where we are prepared to execute on tremendous opportunities that lay ahead, to be in a position where developers, investors, additional social service providers who want to come into the marketplace that is San Jose, they know they will find a collaborative partner in the housing department who seeks out innovative strategies to help address and find ways to execute on our implementation strategy. And then three, it would allow us as a department to provide the best, comprehensive, well thought out, and data-driven policy recommendations to the mayor and council. Those are our short-term goals that essentially situates the department to be an effective administrator, partner, and communicator of how to engage in this work on housing and implement our strategy to get to financing investments that advances our goals and achieves abundant housing stock in the city.
In your mind, as you look at the problems, you look at the challenges of affordable housing stock and homelessness, in your mind, do you see them as a single problem, a single set of problems, or do you see them as distinct problems that have some overlap or some connection?
Well, for me, in approaching this work, the solution to homelessness is housing. And in the Bay Area and in California, we have to look at those solutions around housing on a grading scale because the urgency of need to solve the problem within a city that has over 6,000 unsheltered homelessness. We have to find more immediate solutions and above all approach that says, okay, how do we create a better environment other than encampments that may not provide an immediate interim housing unit or may not provide a board and care site or may not provide a PSH unit, but we can provide a decent safe space that's managed that has some basic needs that is an alternative to an encampment site. So that's one option. Another option is how do we then build out much faster through our interim housing sites, some both temporary and permanent solutions. So that way it's not just a safe space, now it's a safe shelter and potentially a home. And then three, how do we build out more permanent supportive housing so we can transition individuals from that safe space, from that interim housing site into a permanent housing solution, all while acknowledging that there will be individuals who land at an interim housing site. It is on our part to provide them that housing option to go into a PSH or for those sites that are designed to be more of a permanent option around interim housing to remain there. So that connection between homelessness and housing is tied together through that continuum wanting to get to throughput to solve for our housing needs across all families, across all incomes. Because we also need that same amount of throughput in building out market rate housing and building out income housing for 110% of AMI and above, because we have an ever growing employer population in this city. So how do we address it at each stage in the housing continuum? And how does the department best set up, situated, partnered, administered, collaborative, and communicative with all of our partners to say, as you seek to find solutions on homelessness and housing, we can provide a good partnership and customer service there. So that way we can share in this connection between our work around homelessness, closely tethered to our work around housing production and housing options.
Can you tell us, Eric, a little bit about the importance of aligning what the city's housing department is doing with the county's Office of Supportive Housing, maybe how their roles differ, but how they partner? And then also, can you kind of characterize the current relationship, how we're able to interact, share information, collaborate together today?
Yes, so the county, has a significant role in our work around particularly behavioral health and our work around, OSH, and they made their investments over the years into a highly successful program under Measure A as headed up by Consuelo. That team, executed on the county's vision for how do we build out more PSH units, more ELI, extremely low income units, so that way we can build our inventory of housing options. In addition, the county has the work that they do around board and care sites, which I mentioned before, which is roughly over 600 beds in the city of San Jose that provide services to individuals with mental and addictive health challenges. So as they make their investments within the city of San Jose in the behavioral health space, in the housing space, in the healthcare space through their work and innovations that they're doing to access CalAIM, which is a healthcare funding source that could be a source of revenue for interim housing sites on the operating side, synchronizing our strategies between the city and the county and ensuring that the city is able to meet its priorities and those priorities of the county. We're going to be able to leverage substantial resources in the city of San Jose to get to our ultimate end goal here. The county has a great leadership team and look forward to continuing to build relationships with that team so that we can align our shared objectives here of getting to, functional zero in unsheltered homelessness and building out a housing stock within the city that meets the needs of all families within the city of San Jose. So they play a critical role in this. And as we look to expand and further integrate our networks of housing options as part of our homelessness response and interim housing sites and congregate, non-congregate shelter sites and safe sleeping sites. I look forward to growing that partnership with the county so we can ensure we can best leverage and maximize our dollars of investments within the city of San Jose.
You mentioned production a lot, producing new housing. Another element of that strategy that you've alluded to is preservation. Can you explain to our listeners what you mean by preservation? Because I believe there are a few different things that fall under that umbrella of preservation.
Yeah, so when I think about preservation, I think about that in kind of three lanes. So first, a global idea of preservation is for all the new housing we want to add, we got to make sure we're also not losing the housing we currently have. We got to keep what we have so that way the addition of new construction units is an addition and not a replacement. So that's number one. So where do we look at within our existing low-income housing tax credit portfolio for those properties that are, reaching their 15-year LIHTC run and need to be rehabbed, and there's opportunities to recapitalize those assets so we can preserve them and extend their useful life and keep them as affordable. That's one lane. The second lane is then looking at existing assets that may not have affordability restrictions on it, but they are effectively naturally occurring housing stock. When I think of that, it's referred to generally as NOAA's, naturally occurring affordable housing. I look at the housing stock within the 30,000 plus units in our rent stabilization program. And where do we work with our housing providers to ensure we can preserve that housing stock? So for all those residents who live in that housing stock, we can extend the useful life of those units. That's another lane of preservation. And that happens in typically smaller unit buildings, 3 units, 10 units to 15, 18 units. So where do we preserve that lane? They don't have loan restrictions. They don't have covenant restrictions, but they are participating in our rent stabilization program. And so where do we ensure we can make investments there in that lane of preservation? And then thirdly, it's looking at unique ways in which we can acquire land in communities of change and that are experiencing growth to find strategies to build up our nonprofit partners, convert them into community development organizations so we can make collaborative investments to preserve the community's infrastructure, housing infrastructure, to serve those who live in those communities today. So those are kind of our three lanes of preservation. Looking at the LIHTC portfolio that's expiring, looking at our naturally occurring housing units and where do you find opportunities to preserve those units, and looking at our communities more holistically, working with our nonprofit groups and our for-profit developers as well to say, where do we create and finance opportunities for more preservation of those residents in those communities, getting more of our community organizations to become community development organizations so they can own land and real estate in their communities and be more self-determinative in how do they preserve the nature and history within their communities alongside the growth and change that the city will see in the coming decades.
And while we're on the topic of preservation, can you explain the city's Soft Story program to our listeners? I believe it may have a significant impact on housing preservation.
Absolutely. So one of the things that in coming into this job, that's been an exciting kind of unique aspect to the housing stock is this soft story, basically homes built before 1990 that have not been appropriately retrofitted or designed or constructed for substantial seismic activities. Think about the earthquake, what was it, in San Francisco in 1989, and the huge impact it had on the housing stock there. The city sits on 6 fault lines, and 3 of those 6 fault lines are more than due or well overdue for a substantial seismic event. And so when you look at a world of tens of thousands of units that fall into this category, not being appropriately retrofitted to survive a substantial seismic activity, we need to find ways to enact a policy that provides financing to our housing providers to fund the retrofits while also limiting the impact on rents for our tenants. And this is going to require the city to come to the table, for the housing providers to come to the table, for our tenant groups to come to the table, for everyone to share a piece of this burden to completing these retrofits and sharing their fair piece of this burden. And so we're looking at strategies and options for the city to play its role in structuring, working with partners to bring that financing tool to the table and have those conversations with our housing providers and tenant groups to say, here is a strategy that gets to, number one, health and safety of what is effectively an imminent risk to preserving these units, getting the retrofits done. Number two, providing our housing providers an affordable financing option to pay for these retrofits to get completed on their houses as soon as possible, on their units across the city. And then three, ensuring that the structure of the financing allows for a minimal impact on our tenant community. And I think we can put that financing structure together. And I'm confident that over the next couple of weeks here, as we have more consultations with groups and organizations, and we lay out this plan, I'm very hopeful that we can get to a broad coalition of partners who acknowledge the immediate public safety needs related to soft story, and the acknowledgement that everyone's got to carry a portion, their fair portion of this burden. And through this financing scheme, we're going to be able to best position our housing stock, tens of thousands of our housing stock, to survive a seismic event in the future and not add more families to our work around unsheltered homelessness.
Can you briefly explain, from your perspective, what is the relationship between the city of San Jose and the Santa Clara County Housing Authority, which of course is different than the Office of Supportive Housing? Sometimes all these names kind of start to run together, but just for our audience, if you can clarify our relationship with the Santa Clara County Housing Authority, I think that would be great.
Yeah, so the Santa Clara County Housing Authority is actually the merged entity of the Santa Clara Housing Authority and the San Jose Housing Authority. And so their function, coming from the Housing Authority word for many years in Philadelphia and in Tulsa. Their charge is to not only provide decent, safe, affordable housing for all of their tenants on the Housing Choice Voucher Program, but also the over 2,000 units that they own and manage, and a growing development portfolio. So as we look at the city's commitments around providing funding up to 45% of our Measure E dollars and future funds to extremely low income families, the Housing Authority has a significant role and substantial opportunity, as well as resources, to bring together a partnership, a closer partnership with the city of San Jose to execute on our shared objectives. A big portion of the Santa Clara Housing Authority's portfolio is in the city of San Jose. So our merged San Jose Housing Authority, Santa Clara Housing Authority, as administered under the Santa Clara Housing Authority, has a number of shared objectives. And as we look at ways in which to expand and innovate on that partnership and be able to better leverage the funding that both entity has to invest in and secure and stabilize our housing stock and families who are extremely low income, I'm incredibly hopeful and excited about what that partnership will bring. The team, Preston Prince and his team at the Housing Authority, is strong leaders who are committed to our shared objectives. And I look forward to expanding and continuing our partnership there with the Housing Authority.
Well, Eric, thanks for being so generous with your time today. Certainly planning to have a number of other discussions with Eric and dive more deeply into some of the things we've touched on today. But Eric, is there anything you'd like to say as we wrap up the conversation? Anything you'd like our audience to know?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone who took the time to listen to this, to hear what our vision is for the housing department, how our work in the housing department synchronizes to our work throughout the entire city under our One Team initiative, and in our execution of the work that Mayor and Council has set forth for us to achieve. This city has tremendous prosperity and resources, and there is not only political will, but economic will from our employers, from our foundations, from our funders to find innovative solutions to solve our housing crisis. And I take that as my first charge and am both humbled and excited for this opportunity that this position brings. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with many of our partners and hopefully turn a lot of that conversation into action, into preserving and stabilizing our families, into building abundant housing stock, into partnering with all developers and becoming a housing department that facilitates, executes, and administers our partnerships across the entire housing continuum, from our work around homelessness response to market rate housing development. Where do we advance our shared objectives? And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today.
Thanks so much, Eric, for joining me on today's episode. Thanks for listening to Dwellings, the City of San Jose Housing Department podcast. Our theme music is Speed City, composed and performed by Attain Charles. Thanks to San Jose Jazz for letting us use their music. If you like the show, please subscribe and share with your friends and family. If you're looking for more ways to help address housing and homelessness issues in San Jose, please check out the show notes. You can follow the Housing Department on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at SJ City Housing. And if you have questions or comments about today's episode, please send them to housingcoms@sanjoseca.gov. The artwork on our website was created by Chelsea Palacio. Dwellings is produced by me, Jeff Scott, and Jose Chavez of the Housing Department.